Hey, welcome back to the NextGen podcast. I'm Jeff Baxter. I'm your host, and I'm so glad you're tuning into the NextGen podcast each month. And you'll realize that the beginning of the month, if you haven't already, that we do an interview with an expert around the NextGen. And then the second part of the month, I talk about what we talked about in that first part of the month. So if you haven't gone back and listened to Dr. David Fraze's interview with me, it is fantastic. It's so informative, and he's a wealth of wisdom. And in this podcast, I'm going to talk about what we talked about and drill down in some of the details. So I want to share my screen with you. Again, if you're tuning in by video, if not, you can just listen along on the podcast. But I want to share with you some of the insights that he shared, and it's going to fit right in with what we're talking about with the next generation. So I want to share with you some of the things that are happening around the next generation and how we're responding to it and how society is responding. Because one of the things we talked about with Dr. David Fraze last time was there's this gap in relationships with adults, with kids. And if you've listened to previous podcasts, you know that we've talked about how adults are not loving kids for just being kids. They're loving them based on their performance and their grades, or their goals and their grades is what I like to say. And so I want to talk about that just a little bit in this podcast and talk about how the world has changed right before our eyes and society has responded certain ways, and then what we can do about it. So I want to give you some hope, because that's the other thing we talked about at the beginning of the month, is we were talking about how there's a lot of hope around the next generation, and they're asking good questions and they're wrestling with good things. And the next generation is certainly authentic and real. Sometimes we don't like that they're so real and authentic, but it causes us to, as adults, to have good answers for them. So society's response, if you happen to be looking at the video, you'll see my PowerPoint screen. If you're listening by podcast, I'll describe it to you. But a couple of ways that society is responding to the next generation is sports performance. Sports are such a big deal these days, and maybe I'll have an expert on to talk about that specifically. But Dr. Fraze talked about that in relationship to football, and he's in Texas, so football's a really big deal. But he's pouring into kids. But man, older adults are responding to kids based on the performance they have in sports, and if they scored goals or if they performed well or their statistics are good, then they feel loved. But if they're not, then the response of an adolescent or a kid is that they don't feel loved, they don't feel appreciated. Now you could argue that we've always been that way, but no, times have changed, and the way they perceive things are their reality. And if they perceive that I'm only cared for, loved, cheered on based on my sports performance, then they're going to keep trying to perform, and it's just going to wear them out. The picture on my screen to the right-hand side is a Little League World Series where they lost, and these little kids, elementary age, are devastated that they lost the Little League World Series. It's crazy. The picture in the middle is obviously from the 1800s, early 1900s. And, sports used to be, 11-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, all the way through 20-year-olds getting together and playing some baseball or football or basketball, whatever they're doing. They would all get together, and you'll notice in that picture, it's pretty wild that little kid he's got a pipe in his mouth. That's crazy. And then, of course, the picture on the left that I'm describing here is parents are getting in fights over their kids' sporting events, and it's crazy. And another area that is society's response to kids is our family systems. And, our family tree used to look pretty simple, mom and dad and sister and brother and grandma and grandpas, and that's the way it looked. But today, just because of the statistics that we're living in, over half the families are divorced, and as a result, sometimes they're remarried. And that means that the kid has more than one set of parents. They might have two set of parents, or maybe it's a marriage on one side, but not on the other. And then we have step siblings and step grandmas and grandpas, and it gets really complex. It's this geographic puzzle from math class more than than reality. But the reality is that family systems have broken down. And that's not a judgment on families. That's just a reality of what we're handling these days. Is it's complex to be a kid. That's another way that society is responding to kids, and why there's a gap with adults and kids these days. Another area is our educational expectations. It's no fault of teachers or administration or schools. My wife's a teacher. My undergrad is elementary education. My daughter's a teacher. I have a sister who taught school, and another one who did as well for a period of time. And so I love teachers. I love them. And I so appreciate everything that teachers do. But many teachers, can I say this? Many teachers have been given a system where they have to perform just like the kids do. If their school doesn't get it to a certain level, they don't get grants from the government. If certain things don't happen, they might lose their job. If too many parents get upset with them, they're under pressure. And I just know from stories from family and friends who are teachers, that even parents showing up to parent-teacher conferences is becoming less and less and less. And this is a bit of a tragedy. And I know why. It's because parents are super busy and their kids are at a sporting event or whatever's going on. But parents are not leaning in with their kids like they used to. And so the educational expectations on teachers is huge. But then on kids who've been handed the same thing, if they don't perform a certain way, they don't get certain grades, they're not going to get scholarships. And, if we're not careful, we can have whatever's after high school going on to college, university, become small g God if we're not careful. I know I'm being rough and you might not like what I'm saying, but it's just true. And the end game for parenting is not college or university or military or trade school or whatever's next after high school. The end game is for them to become like Jesus and join him on mission. To grow with Jesus is our end game, not education. Education's super important. I have advanced degrees, but that's not the end game. Obviously, educational system has changed and went from a one-room schoolhouse with all the ages in it, which they all learned from one another. It was a beautiful system, not perfect, but beautiful. And then it's now gone to, well, by the time they hit adolescence, middle school and high school, it's almost like they need to figure it out on their own. They no longer have the support structures that they need. And you might say, well, Jeff, yes, they do. They have teachers and counselors, and we have more support in schools than ever before. And that might be true in your context, but in most contexts, and teachers I talk to, and administration I talk to, they don't, the kids don't have the individualized experience that they might need along the way. Those are just three specific ways that society is responding to kids that, as Dr. David Fraze said last time in our podcast at the beginning of the month, that we're creating a gap with kids. And I agree with him. As a result of this, kids are absolutely stressed out. Over 60% of Gen Z have an anxiety disorder. That's 11 years old to mid-20s. They have an anxiety disorder. It's been diagnosed with them with a specialist. 70% of millennials would say that they're experiencing some sort of burnout in life. Listen, junior high, high school, young adults, most of them are experiencing burnout. That's crazy, but it's true. And over half are chronically lonely. Well, so we have to do something about this, friends. We have to do something. We have to lean in and become more loving, grace-filled than ever before with the next generation. So what do we need to do? Well, before I get to what we need to do, let me give you a few more things. As a result of this being stressed out, adolescents are living in an underground world. Let me explain. What do I mean by an underground world? Well, back in the 1950s, the landscape, there was no underground world. Everybody lived the same. I mean, think about this. Adults, teenagers, children, they listen to the same music. They went to the same movies. They dressed the same way. Can you imagine that today? That kids will be looking at their parents and going, "You're so cool," and we're dressed the same way, and everything was the same. And then you get to the 1960s, and a youth culture started to emerge. The Vietnam War, the British invasion of music. JFK was assassinated. And all of a sudden now there's a little ditch in the next generation's world they're starting to create, separating themselves from adults. And then the hole gets bigger in the 70s and the 80s. We started to separate the next generation from adults. Here's the way it played out in church world. We used to, it makes sense for children, about fourth grade and under to have maybe a children's sermon, and then we separate them and they go to children's Sunday school class. But then about the 70s, youth ministries started to pop up, Youth for Christ, Campus Kids Saved for Christ. Billy Graham was a big deal in youth crusades. And then churches started to catch on and realized, hey, those teenagers are kind of making a ruckus over there in church. Let's give them a separate space out of the goodness of our hearts with good intentions for them to be able to do whatever they want to. And I was a youth pastor, and this happened to me more than one time. I was given a youth room space to paint the walls, to do whatever I wanted to do with it. That was kind of a dangerous thing to do, to give a 20-something space to do something with high schoolers and middle schoolers. And I realized that the facilities team, the custodian, did not help me at all to clean that room. So it was on me to clean that room. Well, what do? We separated youth from older adults. We stopped doing intergenerational ministry, which Dr. Fraze mentioned last time in our podcast. So the gap is widening with the next generation. We get to the 90s and 2000s, and it's fully a ditch. It's now been sealed over the top with those wooden planks in this picture that I'm describing. And all of a sudden now they're in their own world. And it's really hard for adults to break in. And digital media and social media have skyrocketed them being in their ditch, separated from the world, living in the underground world. And the best we can do, it seems, is like to sit on the stairs of the underground world and be available to them and love them and care for them as they're trying to discern whether adults love me for my goals and grades or whether they love me out of grace or not. And so we need to do something about this. We need to lean in a little bit more. As a result of them being stressed out, here's the second thing I would say is adolescents live out of multiple selves or identities or avatars. As my good friend, Dr. Chap Clark, who was on an earlier podcast, started to talk about those avatars. And I want to talk about this a little bit because many of us don't realize that adolescents, remember, that's ages 11 through about mid-20s, they're trying to figure out who they are, identity, autonomy, and belonging. And they're taking on different selves. And so when parents, when we say to them any given day, and I've been guilty of doing it too, we'd say to them, hey, you're not acting like yourself today. And the reality is they don't even know who they are yet. So they don't know what you're talking about. So as a result, we got to be careful that we don't project on them and tell them to be something. They don't even know who they are. All of my kids are going through this or have gone through this, and they've tried on different things. They're an athlete, they're a student, they're a friend. They might listen to country music or Christian music or run cross country or play tennis, or start to have jobs or in the summertime or during the school year. And then they're online. And that's where my friend, Dr. Chap Clark, would say that they've not only become different selves or taken on different selves, but now they have avatars where they're actually a different self online. And if they're on Snapchat, they're a different person than they are on Instagram, than they are in Visco, than they are in a different app. And by the way, the apps are going to change over time. They're not going to be these, because as soon as the next generation realizes their parents and older adults are on these apps with them, they're going to create their new app to jump on with. I love this quote from Susan Harper, The Complexity of Self in Adolescence. She says, adolescents develop a proliferation of selves that vary as a function of social context. These include self with father, mother, close friend, romantic partner, peers, as well as self in the role of student, on the job, as an athlete. A critical development task of adolescence, therefore, is the construction of multiple selves in different roles and relationships. This is just a natural part of being an adolescent, about ages 11 to mid-20s, to figure it out. Another result of them being stressed out and separated from adults is listen, these successful kids learn to adapt. Sometimes we get tricked into thinking that, hey, the valedictorian, the one getting straight A's, the one who's got a great job, the one who can carry on an adult conversation with kids, they've got it all figured out. And man, are they mature. They have become an adult already. Don't be tricked, friends. Don't be tricked. What looks like an adult on the outside physically, psychosocial development tells us, and brain development through MRIs on the frontal lobe tell us that they're not an adult yet, even though they have figured out how to play the game, so to speak. They've figured out how to be successful because it's the adults who are putting the expectations on them to perform, whether on the athletic field or get the right grades or in the right class. They've learned how to adapt to the pressures that adults have put on them. So don't be tricked into thinking that adolescents have become adults now. They haven't. We just know they haven't. So be careful of that. Here's what Denise Clark Pope, a PhD, who's done the study on this, says: successful students have devised various ways to stay ahead of their peers and to please those in power positions, that is teachers, coaches, pastors. Unsuccessful students, for a variety of reasons, were not as adept at playing the survival game. So that's another way that we're separating. And if we're not careful, this is all going to be a house of cards. If we're not careful in developing a firm faith foundation with our kids and understanding adolescent development, we're setting them up to leave high school and leave their faith and leave the church along with it all. So if you're a parent listening in and you have a child that's in second grade, third grade, fourth grade, I'm so glad you're tuning in now, because adolescence is coming. It's coming. If you're in the middle of this adolescent journey, you might need to make some adjustments. Otherwise, it's all going to be set up and they're not going to hang on to their faith because they're just playing the game right now. They're hanging on to your faith or the church's faith or the youth pastor's faith, but not their own faith. So we got to make some adjustments and understand where they're coming from. Otherwise, it's a house of cards. If you've come through this and you're listening to this, or you're a teacher or a coach, I just encourage you to make sure you're not tricked into thinking they're more mature, further along than they really are. Because again, we just know through psychosocial development and brain development that they are not quite there yet. Another area is that friendships have changed. This is interesting. So it used to be cliques, but now it's moved to clusters. Cliques used to be those peer groups back in the 70s and 80s that were all associated with different activities or sports. Like the basketball team did not associate with the band members. They did not associate with we called them stoners on the corner at lunchtime. They didn't associate with the computer nerds or whatever. And now today they're in clusters. Ask the average teenager who their friends are, and they would say, oh, they got somebody in band and choir and cross country, and they've got somebody who's probably not doing great things on the weekend. They're all their friends. So what's the common denominator? What do they have in common? Well, I like to say what they have in common is mutual self-protection. You've got my back, I've got yours. It's more gang-like. It's just trying to survive and get through this thing called middle school or high school or young adult years. It's trying to survive. And so I like to say it's gone from the movie Grease over to Hunger Games. You remember the movie Grease? It was Danny was with the leather jacket gang and all the pink ladies, and what got really wacky is when Danny tried out for the basketball team or the track team. It didn't work. It didn't work for him back then. And now today it's Hunger Games. Well, what do all those people have in common? They're just trying to survive. They're just trying to get through the game, just trying to get through it. So they literally live to get through it. And you got my back, I got yours, and we're going to get through this thing together. It's gone from cliques to clusters. And I encourage you, if you're listening, to go test this. Go try it out. Go ask somebody who's part of the next generation or an adolescent, teenager. Ask them who their friends are and see. I think you're going to find a lot of diversity as opposed to the way it was in the 70s and 80s or even early 90s when we were growing up. Another area is that's causing this gap between adults and kids is they have more freedoms and dangers, and therefore anxiety is increased and gone off the charts. If you're looking at this picture I have up on my screen from the video, you'll see that kids, because of anxiety, are coping in all sorts of ways that they shouldn't be, through romantic partnerships, through whether they're drinking, whether they're doing drugs, and then they end up self-harm, cutting themselves, or other things that are vaping. They're doing all sorts of things that hurt themselves psychosocially. It's actually slowing down their adolescent development, becoming a mature Jesus-following adult. It's obviously compromising on morals. It's a tragedy, and it's all because of what we've set up with the next generation. So how can we help? How can we help? Here's some ideas. Number one, build a scaffolding of relationships around the next generation. Build relationships with teachers, coaches, administration, youth pastors, senior pastors, so you can surround your child, if you're a parent, or you can mentor and surround kids with as many Christ-following adults as they possibly can have. But this is a scaffolding of relationships that goes beyond the church. Boy, if you don't know your child's teacher or multiple teachers, get to know them. If you don't know your child's coach, get to know them on a personal level. Find out what they're all about. Figure out which people in your neighborhood and which friends you have as an adult that can come alongside your kids. And then number two is adding more Christ-following adults in your kids' lives. I want to challenge you to find 5 Christ-following adults that you can surround your kids who, listen to this, you give them permission to speak into their lives. So here's where we come up short. We might say, oh yeah, my kid's surrounded. I go to church. They've got some other adults around. I've got some friends who are following Jesus, and we rub shoulders with our kids, and that's awesome. But take it to the next level. Tell those friends that you can speak into my child's life. You may not agree on everything, or all your politics, or all your religion, or how you raise kids, but you trust them enough that if your kid doesn't come to you, they're going to go to that other Christ-following adult, and they're going to be doing all right. So I encourage you to do that. Third is, listen to this, healthy brain development is healthy attachment. We know from studies and research from the next generation that their brain develops faster. They get their frontal lobe of their brain faster, which is the part that reasons forward. They can determine that if I do things right now, it's going to affect other people around me. It's going to affect my future. That brain development is faster the more healthy attachments in the home there are. In other words, when mom and dad are present in the lives of an upper elementary, middle school, and high schooler, even into young adults, the brain is going to develop faster and healthier because of those healthy attachments to mom and dad at home. I've talked before that when they're growing up, obviously there's a maternal attachment that makes sense to mom. Obviously, mom brought the baby into the world, and so there's a natural attachment. When they start to hit middle school and high school years, I really encourage dads to have the paternal attachment, to lean in, because there are also statistics that show that the healthier dad is to his adolescents, to his kids that are in adolescence, that the healthier their brain development is going to move along, and they're going to mature faster. But the opposite's true too. If dad and mom are not present, or not leaning in, or just letting them do it on their own, and we think they're just become responsible, they should be able to figure it out on their own. They can't. They shouldn't. We should lean in and help them, not in a helicopter parent or a snowplow parent sort of way with a 360 app that's tracking every move they make. That's not healthy. But we ought to be leaning in such a way that they feel loved for who they are, just for who they are, not based on how they did on the athletic field or in the classroom, but based on who they are. They're going to develop faster and in a more healthy way if we do that. It takes a whole community to raise a healthy Jesus-following kid. We know that, but we need to lean in and do this thing together. So what's the role of parents? Let me fly through a few things with you. Obviously, the role of parents, the seasons change. I want to talk about 3 different roles that you're going to play. The first one's Sherpa. When they're about ages 0 to 10, 11, 12, you're just a Sherpa. You're just hauling their gear. You're just bringing it along. You're probably making runs to the school because they forgot something. And you have to make a decision whether you're going to die in that hill or whether you're going to help them along when they're younger. Now, I'm not talking about when they're in middle school and high school. I'm talking about when they're younger. You know, your son who's in elementary school is coming out of school, and he may have one shoe on, and you're going, Joe, where's your shoe? And he's like, what shoe? I didn't even know I had shoes today. I mean, you got to help him along. You're a Sherpa. You're just hauling gear. And then a transition happens. When they hit about 11 to 18 years old, you're going to be a rabbi. You should be leaning in. Now, listen, you may not think you know the Bible well enough. You may not think you're spiritually far enough down the road, and you may not think that you're the best person. And so you think the youth pastor or the lead pastor or another mentor knows the Bible or is more spiritual than you. Listen, parents, if you're a parent listening to this, listen, you need to lean in and listen to this principle. As you're growing, you want to come along with your child and help them grow. So you could do a study together. You could study the Bible together. You could talk about some verses together, and you could be authentic with them and say, you know what, I don't have it all figured out yet. And you could apologize a lot when you fail. That'll go a long way in illustrating forgiveness and love and grace towards your child. But during these 11 to 18 years old years, you ought to be leaning in and doing most of the teaching and modeling, because more is caught than taught most of the time. And so you're kind of in that rabbi phase. And then here's the good news. If you come out of high school into the 20s, in my family, I'm starting to experience this with my two oldest, they start to come back around and ask for your wisdom in certain areas of your life. And you become a sage. You become that older saint who has some wisdom and some life experience, and you might not seem as dull and boring, and they don't think you're an idiot anymore. So they circle back around and they want to ask you some questions about how to live this thing along. And so you could continue to do a Bible study with them. You could continue to pray with them. You could continue to dialogue about some things. And all along the way, while you're being a rabbi and a sage, allow your children to doubt. Allow them to question. Allow them to question anything. Don't be freaked out by that. Allow that wrestling to happen. And you lean in with more grace, more love, and teach them more biblical principles, and you're going to see that it pays off down the road. So I want to end right here with this particular podcast and just again reiterate that this is the time where we need to lean in, parents, teachers, coaches, administration, with the next generation. We need to lean in when they're getting towards upper elementary, middle school, high school, young adult years. We need to be present, not perfect, just present. As you follow Jesus, let them follow Jesus. Just like Paul said, man, as I'm following the Lord, you follow along with me. Not because I've figured it out or arrived, but because I'm on this journey with you. Come alongside with your child, your mentor, your student, and you're going to be amazed at what happens with that relationship. Think long-term, think marathon, not sprint. You're in this thing for the long haul. Parenting never ends. This side of heaven, until you go home to be with Jesus, parenting is never going to end. So the stages change, the seasons change, but parenting doesn't end. So I really encourage you to lean in, understand your role, and understand what's really happening with the next generation so we don't miss them, because you have to have the right diagnosis to give the right prescription. So I encourage you to do the right things, but at the end of the day, extend more grace, because grace will bring them home. So thanks again for tuning in to this NextGen podcast. I look forward to being with you again next month. Until then, thanks so much, and be sure to share this if it's helpful, if it's encouraging. I encourage you to share it with other people along the way, and subscribe on YouTube, as well as all of the places where our NextGen and our podcasts at Mission Hills Church are broadcast. Go subscribe. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. This podcast is hosted by me, Jeff Baxter, along with special guests who are experts in the industry. We're mixed and edited by Leopard Productions. Our senior producer is Colin McFarland. Our video director is Zach Anderson, and our digital and SEO specialist is Maddie Brower. The NextGen podcast is part of a Mission Hills podcast network here at Littleton, Colorado. Thanks for listening.